This happened many years ago when I was about 10 or 11 years old. I wouldn't describe the area I was in as backwoods necessarily, but it was a wooded 100+ acre ranch. The land is in the southwest part of the United States. My family owns the property and we have family reunions every year, and all stay for about 5 days to camp. There's an area of the ranch where we all set up camp and cook and eat. Getting to that part of the ranch requires driving through a small village and several gates for about 2 miles. The first gate beyond the village is slightly past a set of railroad tracks. That's a lot of description, but it's relevant later in the story. Because I had been camping at the ranch for as long as I could remember, and the land was private, my parents would allow me to go off on my own during the day as long as I didn't go too far. I spent time walking the property near our camp area, looking for arrowheads or trying to catch the tadpoles in the ponds. On this day, I left the large camp area after lunch, which was around 11:30, and told my mom I was going to a nearby creek. I planned on catching some tadpoles to bring back to camp and be back on time for a swimming trip with my cousins. They wanted to go to a nearby river and I didn't really want to miss it. I made it down to the creek and got several tadpoles. I probably spent a total of 15 minutes down there. To get back to camp, I would have needed to either climb up a relatively steep embankment with a lot of loose rock, or circle around on a longer route with a flat trail. I usually go up the embankment, but I didn't have a top for the water bottle I caught the tadpoles with, and didn't want to risk slipping and spilling them out or killing them. I had never walked the longer trail by myself, but I had with my dad and felt confident I could find my way back to camp on it. As I walked back to camp, I had my head down looking for arrowheads in the washed out areas of the trail. I started feeling a little creeped out as I was continued walking. We all know that feeling, like someone is watching. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to just getting spooked being on the trail by myself. Now the next part I can't explain whatsoever. It's as if a light switch was turned on or someone snapped their fingers and I came back to reality. Except when I came back, I wasn't on the trail I had been on before. I was near the railroad tracks and it was completely dark. My mom was standing in front of me, shaking my shoulders and yelling, "Where were you?" Two things I remember really clearly about the moments are, one, the look of fear and anger and relief in my mom's tearful eyes as she was yelling at me, and two, the confusion I felt about what the hell was going on. The last thing I remembered was walking on the trail back to camp, and now suddenly it was dark and I was at the railroad tracks leading to the ranch, which was over 2 miles away. The best way I can describe it is to compare to the movie The Butterfly Effect. The main character would be living in one moment, then suddenly he wake up somewhere entirely different. My parents drove me back to camp and I learned it was 10:30 p.m. This meant I had been gone for 11 hours, about 10 and a half of which I can't account for to this day. My parents and all my family had understandably freaked the hell out when I hadn't returned to camp. They had been looking for me all day. I was a really good kid growing up and almost never broke any rules, so my parents were baffled at my behavior. I tried to explain to them that I had no memory of getting back to the tracks, but they didn't believe me. They thought maybe I got lost and was embarrassed to admit it. This was the only time I've ever experienced something like this. I can't explain how unsettling it is to not be able to account for all those hours I was gone. Was it a coincidence that I had that creeped out feeling on the trail and then just lost 10 and a half hours of my life? I wish I had answers for what happened. I wasn't sure if I should post this or not, but I needed the validation that I'm not insane. I've never really had paranormal experiences, but I cannot explain this. I'm in college and me and some other 7 people from my school went on a backpacking trip, and we had 2 experienced leaders. We drove to Zaleski State Park, which is in the Appalachian region of Ohio. It was early April this year, and it was cold and everything was still dead from winter. After hiking miles into the forest, we set up camp at the backpacking campsite, and there were a couple of other groups of people as well. A few of them were friendly older couples, and then 2 college-aged girls. Everyone was pretty spread out from each other. We set up camp further away from everyone else. I've always been able to sense energies of places, and the energy in this area wasn't great. It was almost spooky. Each of us had individual one-person tents, and we formed kind of a cluster in this site, with my tent being in the back so no one was behind me. The cluster was also right next to the forest, because this backpacking site was like a big cleared off square in the middle of the trees. Fast forward, I'm dead asleep around 2 a.m., and I wake up to leaves crunching right behind my tent. I hear footsteps walking in circles around my tent. They had a sort of heaviness to them that couldn't be a deer or a dog. Also, it sounded like just 2 legs. I cannot make this up. This creature was circling my tent for long periods of time, slowly creeping up to the sides of my tent, and then just stopping for periods of time, and then would move on to walking around the rest of our tent cluster. I could hear a human-like breathing from the mouth when it was close to my tent, like a sort of heaving. I was shaking, too scared to unzip my tent and investigate. I kid you not, this occurred for hours, and it seemed I was the only one awake. Out of nowhere, I seen an illuminated light shape from my tent. Although I couldn't tell what it was from inside my tent, because it was all zipped up, it was like a warm glow and it didn't move, like a flashlight would. I was paralyzed in fear. I simply couldn't believe it was an animal. At some point I fell asleep due to sheer exhaustion, but I could hear the heavy steps circling until I did. In the morning I questioned my fellow campers about it, and my leader admitted she heard the footsteps and noises as well, admitting it was bizarre and she would have investigated had she not been so groggy. One of the boys in the group said he also noticed the light that came on, but thought it was someone else. Not a single person in this room went up to go to the bathroom or turned on light that night. I heard things about the Appalachian regions being creepy and bizarre, but now I believe it. Some people on Reddit have leaned towards Bigfoot because apparently he's associated with light orbs. Never been a big believer, but I'm telling you, this didn't feel like just any animal. My brother is 2 years older, and we spent 10,000 hours and then some in the woods together. Whether it was building forts or BMX tracks to LARPing and hunting, we've traveled across the US exploring caves, canyons, cliff diving, mountain biking, camping, etc. I feel like adding this is important because there's genuinely nothing I wouldn't do or fear when I have him by my side. But this time was different, and we both felt it. We've had our fair share of adventures and stories to tell of all sorts, but this one has felt like a lingering stain on my memory. We were both mid-20s-ish, and it was 2019, and this was probably my 5th time hunting the area, and the first I brought my brother along. It's a large forest area of public land that has a few county roads which are basically 2 tracks that stretch miles throughout the area. We make the trip up in my truck with our tents, 3 in total, 1 for each of us and another to change in and keep our gear in. Without making this long-winded, we set up camp a couple miles from the truck, which we drove for quite a few miles through the trails, basically in the middle of nowhere. The nearest main road is probably 8 to 10 miles away. We arrived late in the night, set up camp, and quickly fell asleep after a long trip. We spent the next day scouting, then made back to the camp for the night. We cooked, then ate, had some beers, and bullshitted. The night was still early, but we had a long day and decided to head off for the night. Everything up until this point was normal. I suddenly awoke to something smacking my tent and hearing my brother's voice call my name. I knew something was off. I called back to him and he immediately unzipped my tent and made his way inside. I could tell he was disturbed when I went to ask him what's wrong, and he immediately grabbed my shoulder and told me to shush. The sun wasn't up yet, so I think it was 4:30 or 5 a.m. We sat in my tent, and what we heard still confuses me to this day. I can only explain it as whale sounds. Different tones of extremely loud noises that I could feel throughout my body. It would come and go, but there were only a few seconds of silence in between the sounds. It would vary from high-pitched squeals and everything in between to very low sounds that had literal ground-shaking reverb. I regrettably didn't think to grab my phone or record anything that was going on, because what I was hearing didn't seem real, and at that moment I was awestruck. The sound went on until daylight and started to break. I believe it was about an hour, but I'm not really sure. Neither of us spoke, and at the time it felt like I could feel the energy around me, almost like my body was covered in white noise, if that makes any sense. It wasn't even minutes after the sound stopped, it started to rain, and one of the craziest thunderstorms while I was camping outside. The forecast didn't predict or account for any rain the days we were going to be there prior to making the trip. All the stakes for our tent and our gear was completely ripped out of the ground, and both of our tents had multiple stakes ripped out as well. Those things were driven into the ground with an axe, and would take some insane force to unearth even a single one. My brother dismisses it and won't even talk about it, saying it was just some machinery being dragged. But at the time, we both shared the same feeling of fear and dread. Just seems odd it was still the middle of the night, and we were so far removed from any nearby communities to hear and experience this occurrence. Back in about March of this year, I went camping with a friend, my boyfriend, and 3 dogs. My friend slept in his tent with his dog, and I slept in my tent with my 2 dogs and my boyfriend. My friend's tent was about 30 feet away from ours, and we were camping in the North GA Mountains off an old Forest Service road. We were right next to a creek. For context, I'm an experienced backpacker, and I'm familiar with the usual nighttime sounds, like rustling in the leaves, sticks breaking, cicadas, etc. I have a lot of experience camping by myself, so it's rare that I get spooked out by anything, other than the other humans nearby, as I'm aware of the dangers of traveling solo as a woman. However, this particular night, I wake up in the middle of the night with a sense of absolute dread I've never felt before. I check my phone and it's about 3:30, 4 a.m. I really had to use the bathroom and was debating on whether I wanted to try to put my hiking boots on and venture outside to go or just try and hold it until daylight. I didn't want to wake up the dogs because if they heard me putting on my boots, they'll likely want to go outside to go to the bathroom as well. I'm still in the tent. That's when I notice it. It's almost like a hum, but not in the pleasant way where it's a tune or anything like that. It's a low-pitched hum. It was a low-pitched hum that was reverberating through the campsite and through my body. It had 2 tones. It started with a relatively higher pitch and would switch to the relatively lower pitch after a period of time. Then it would start over without a break in the sound at all. It wasn't soft either. It felt like it was covering the entire wooded area we were in. It didn't sound like an animal, a person, or machine, or anything that I've ever heard. At this point, I absolutely cannot hold off on the bathroom trip any longer. I quickly put on my hiking boots and quietly tell my dogs to stay put. My boyfriend is still sleeping. I unzipped the tent and went outside, and the entire campsite was covered in this spooky ass fog. But it felt like it was my vision that was foggy, not the actual air. I couldn't see a damn thing. The 2-tone humming then got louder. I do my business maybe 5 feet from my tent. Sorry, but there's no way I was venturing any further than that. And quickly nope the hell back into my tent and bury myself into the sleeping bag with a sweatshirt over my head to try and drown out or ignore the humming. The dogs raise their heads and growl a few times throughout the experience. But that isn't unusual for them when camping. I never saw any figures or lights in the woods, but I was also not looking for them and was trying to ignore the entire experience.